Kelthera Prime wasn't supposed to explode today. Then again, most things that explode rarely schedule themselves on anyone's calendar with proper advance notice. The research station orbited a dying red giant approximately 47 light-years from anywhere particularly interesting, which made it perfect for studying stellar According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. K-patterns without worrying about inconvenient things like nearby civilizations or trade routes. 14 species contributed to the facility, each bringing their own peculiar flavor of scientific obsession and cultural neuroses to what was essentially a very expensive metal can floating in the cosmic equivalent of a bad neighborhood. The Keltheran Accords, signed approximately 2 centuries prior in Galactic Standard Time, had established quite clearly that multi-species research outposts required certain safety protocols. These weren't suggestions, they weren't gentle recommendations whispered by concerned administrators over complimentary beverages. They were ironclad, legally binding, your entire planet gets sanctioned if you ignore them regulations that had been written in the aftermath of the Prexis Station incident, which nobody discussed at dinner parties anymore because it involved 7,000 casualties and some truly unfortunate physics. Protocol 17, subsection C, paragraph 9 stated with admirable clarity, "In the event of catastrophic reactor failure, all personnel must proceed immediately to designated escape pods via primary evacuation routes, with no deviations, no exceptions, and absolutely no stopping to grab personal effects, pets, or experimental samples, regardless of their sentimental or scientific value." The protocol had been written by a committee of Thalaxian bureaucrats who possessed all the emotional warmth of a particularly ambitious calculator, and it showed. When the reactor started making sounds that large mechanical systems should definitely not make, sounds that suggested metal was having philosophical disagreements with physics, the station's artificial intelligence broadcast the evacuation order with a sort of calm, professional monotone that somehow made impending doom sound like a minor scheduling inconvenience. "Attention, all personnel. Reactor containment breach detected. Estimated time to critical failure, 11 minutes, 43 seconds. Please proceed to designated escape pods. Your cooperation is appreciated." Appreciated. As if everyone had a choice between evacuation and perhaps staying behind for tea. The Vrexian scientists, tall bipeds with crystalline skin that refracted light in distinctly unsettling patterns, moved with a sort of efficient precision that came from having 3 separate brains working in parallel processing. They collected their data cores, sealed their lab equipment according to protocol, and glided toward the north evacuation corridor with the grace of beings who had spent millennia perfecting the art of not panicking. There were Metherian engineers, aquatic creatures requiring mobile containment suits filled with pressurized ammonia, withdrew their sensory tendrils from the propulsion systems they'd been calibrating and propelled themselves toward their designated pods with liquid efficiency. Their suits made soft gurgling sounds as they moved, which might have been their species equivalent of concerned muttering, though the translation matrices never quite captured Metherian emotional nuance properly. Dr. Kilvesh, the station's Thalaxian medical officer, abandoned his sick bay with the sort of ruthless pragmatism his species had elevated to an art form. He'd been treating a Corvin researcher for minor radiation exposure, mild enough that it would probably resolve itself within a standard week. Probably. The protocols didn't include provisions for probably, so he grabbed the emergency medical kit, informed his patient to walk faster, and headed for the pods. Everyone followed their training. Everyone remembered the simulations. Everyone understood that reactor breaches operated on strict timelines that didn't negotiate or offer extensions for good behavior. The engineering bay, located in the station's lower sections where the artificial gravity got slightly confused and maintenance crews regularly bumped their heads on conduits, housed the primary reactor monitoring systems. It also housed, at this particular moment, One human engineer who'd been shoulder-deep in a plasma coolant junction when the universe decided to make things interesting. Humans had joined the galactic community approximately 87 years ago, which in cosmic terms was roughly equivalent to 5 minutes. They'd arrived in ships held together with what appeared to be optimism and spite, introduced themselves with enthusiastic incompetence, and immediately began doing things that made actuaries on 17 different worlds revise their life insurance premiums upward. The human, covered in coolant residue and wearing the sort of expression that suggested the universe had personally insulted their family, yanked their arm free from the junction as alarms blared with increasing urgency. Standard procedure dictated immediate evacuation. The nearest pod waited approximately 300 meters away through 2 sealed bulkheads and 1 decontamination chamber. They made it halfway to the corridor before hearing something that absolutely shouldn't have been there. A cry, high-pitched, desperate, coming from the lower maintenance bay. Maintenance bays didn't cry. Maintenance bays contained spare parts, backup systems, and occasionally forgotten lunch containers that had evolved into new forms of sentient life. They didn't contain anything that made sounds of distress. The human stopped, turned, stared at the access ladder leading down into the maintenance level with the sort of calculation that suggested their brain was having a fierce argument with itself. The station's artificial intelligence, noting a deviation from expected evacuation patterns, offered a helpful reminder through the nearest speaker. "Technician, please proceed to designated escape pod immediately. Time to critical failure, 9 minutes, 18 seconds. 9 minutes. Plenty of time to reach safety. Seal themselves in a pod and eject far enough that the explosion would merely be a spectacular light show, rather than a spectacularly fatal light show." The cry came again. 2 voices this time, overlapping in harmonics that suggested youth and absolute terror. The human's jaw tightened in that peculiar way humans' jaws tightened when they were about to do something magnificently stupid. They grabbed the ladder and descended. The lower maintenance bay existed in permanent twilight, lit only by emergency strips that had been emergency strips for so long they'd forgotten any other way of being. Pipes ran along every surface like mechanical intestines, carrying coolant and fuel and various substances that probably had names but mostly got called the blue stuff, or the thing that burns if you touch it. Behind a fallen storage container, wedged between 2 coolant pipes that radiated enough heat to make the air shimmer, 2 Velcor cubs huddled in absolute terror. Velcors were a recent addition to the galactic community themselves, barely 40 years into their spacefaring era. They resembled what might happen if someone described a large feline to an artist who'd never actually seen a cat but had strong opinions about geometry. 4 eyes, 6 limbs, covered in fur that shifted colors based on emotional state. Currently, both cubs displayed patterns of white and gray that translated roughly to, "We're going to die and we know it." The human assessed the situation with impressive speed. The cubs were trapped. The fallen storage container had wedged itself at an angle that created a pocket of space too small for an adult Velcor to navigate, but apparently perfect for 2 cubs to hide in during a crisis. The pipes on either side were too hot to move without proper equipment. The ceiling above showed stress fractures that suggested touching anything might trigger a collapse. Time to critical failure, 8 minutes, 9 seconds. The human's radio crackled. A voice, speaking in heavily accented standard, came through with a sort of panic that transcended species boundaries. "Has anyone seen the cubs?" "The medical officer's cubs. They were playing in the observation lounge. I can't find them. They're not in the pod. They're not." The human tapped their radio. "Found them. Lower maintenance bay. I'm getting them out." A pause. Then Dr. Kilvesh's voice, steady despite circumstances that absolutely didn't warrant steadiness. "Technician, you can't. The protocols..." "Yeah, well, protocols didn't account for kids hiding in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. The reactor will achieve critical mass in less than 8 minutes. Then I better work fast." The human clicked off the radio before the doctor could mount a proper argument, which saved everyone involved approximately 2 minutes of debate that would have ended the same way regardless. Above, throughout the station, escape pods began launching. Small bursts of thrust, metal spheres ejecting into space with the sort of orderly precision that came from everyone following the rules, everyone doing exactly what they'd been trained to do, everyone making the mathematically correct choice. Below, in a maintenance bay that smelled like ozone and regret, one human approached two terrified cubs who'd never seen a human before and probably thought they were some sort of oddly proportioned nightmare creature. "Hey," the human said softly, crouching down to make themselves smaller. "I know I look weird. Trust me. Every species thinks I look weird. But we need to leave. Right now." The cubs pressed themselves further back, their fur rippling with colors that suggested fear had achieved new depths previously unmapped by science. The human glanced at the pipes, at the ceiling, at the narrow space that separated life from considerably less than life. Their brain, that magnificent organ that had gotten humanity simultaneously into and out of countless disasters, began calculating angles, weights, and thermal tolerances with a sort of speed that came from being a species that regularly fixed things by hitting them with progressively larger tools until something worked. Time to critical failure: 7 minutes, 2 seconds. The human smiled, which probably didn't help their case with the cubs given that humans smiling involved showing teeth, and teeth generally implied predation across most of known space. "Right," they said to nobody in particular, beginning to pull off their thermal jacket. "Let's add worst decision ever to my personnel file." Above them, the last few escape pods launched, carrying crews who stared at their sensor displays and wondered if perhaps humans had some sort of species-wide condition that made them allergic to self-preservation. The thermal jacket, designed to protect against temperatures that would turn most organic matter into regrettable stains, got wrapped around the humans' hands like the world's most expensive oven mitts. They grabbed the nearest coolant pipe, which was radiating enough heat to make the air taste like burning metal, and began pulling. Physics, that cruel mistress of the universe, had opinions about this approach. Specifically, physics suggested that pulling on a pipe connected to a failing reactor system ranked somewhere between inadvisable and spectacularly moronic on the decision-making spectrum. The pipe shifted approximately 3 centimeters. The human's muscles, built from a gravity well that was frankly excessive by galactic standards, strained against metal that hadn't been designed to move. Sweat dripped into their eyes, which was probably the least of their problems given that radiation levels were climbing toward "you'll glow in the dark" territory. Time to critical failure: 6 minutes, 14 seconds. One of the cubs whimpered, a sound that translated across species barriers as universal terror. The human glanced at them, at those 4 eyes wide with fear, and something in their expression hardened into the sort of determination that had gotten humanity from cave-dwelling to starfaring despite every logical argument against it. Humans, see, had a peculiar evolutionary quirk. Most species developed survival instincts that amounted to "don't die, avoid the dangerous thing." Humans had developed survival instincts that whispered, "But what if we tried anyway?" This had led to achievements like agriculture, spaceflight, and quantum mechanics. It had also led to achievements like "hold my beverage while I attempt this obviously fatal stunt," becoming a recognized phrase in 17 languages. The human released the pipe, grabbed a support strut, and planted their feet against the wall in a position that suggested they'd been watching too many action vids. They pushed with their legs while pulling with their arms, creating a lever system that would have made ancient engineers weep with pride or horror, possibly both. The storage container groaned, shifted, moved another handful of centimeters. Behind them, through the station's deteriorating communication network, voices crackled through the speakers. The escape pods had reached minimum safe distance. Sensors aboard those pods tracked everything happening on the station with the sort of morbid fascination usually reserved for watching accidents unfold in slow motion. "The human is still in the maintenance bay," someone reported, their voice carrying the stunned disbelief of witnessing someone ignore every survival instinct evolution had spent millions of years installing. Radiation exposure must be entering hazardous levels, another voice added. This one belonging to a Vrexian scientist whose 3 brains were probably trying to calculate exactly how many kinds of radiation poisoning were currently competing for first place. Why? This question came from a younger crew member, someone who'd clearly never worked with humans before. Why would anyone stay? The medical officer's voice cut through the chatter, tight with something that might have been grief or might have been pride. Possibly both. Because those are my children, and apparently humans have a broken sense of risk assessment. Back in the maintenance bay, the human finally wrenched the storage container aside enough to create a gap. They squeezed through, thermal jacket abandoned, skin already reddening from heat exposure that would require a lengthy visit to the medical bay, assuming they survived long enough to need one. "All right, listen," the human said to the cubs, keeping their voice steady despite circumstances that absolutely didn't warrant steadiness. "I'm going to pick you both up. You're going to hold on. And we're going to run very, very fast." The cubs stared at this alien creature who just demonstrated strength that violated their understanding of biology. Humans weren't particularly large by galactic standards. They weren't covered in armor plating. They didn't have the advantage of multiple limbs or enhanced musculature from heavy gravity evolution beyond their own world's already excessive pull. What they did have, apparently, was an absolute unwillingness to leave children behind regardless of species, common sense, or mathematical probability. The human scooped up both cubs, one under each arm, and discovered that young Velcors weighed approximately as much as equipment crates. Their fur, now cycling through colors that suggested confusion, had joined fear in the emotional spectrum, felt surprisingly soft against skin that was developing what would later be classified as second-degree burns. Time to critical failure. 4 minutes, 38 seconds. The human looked at the ladder leading up, then at the cubs, then at the ladder again, performing calculations that didn't require advanced mathematics to conclude, "This is going to hurt." They started climbing one-handed, other arm wrapped around 2 cubs who decided that clinging to the strange alien was preferable to certain death. Each rung represented a small victory against gravity, common sense, and several laws of physics that were frankly offended at being treated so casually. Above, in the escape pods, every sensor focused on that lone human signal moving through the station. Some watched with horror, some with fascination. The medical officer watched with something that transcended both, his claws digging into his seat's armrests hard enough to leave permanent marks. The human reached the main level, legs shaking from exertion and radiation exposure, and began running toward the evacuation corridor with a burden that shouldn't have been possible to carry at that speed. Behind them, the reactor's containment fields began their final, fatal collapse. The evacuation corridor had been designed for orderly, civilized departure during emergencies. It had not been designed for a human sprinting at speeds that suggested their ancestors had been pursued by very motivated predators while carrying 2 alien cubs who weighed collectively more than most species' luggage allowance. The human's boots hammered against deck plating that was beginning to buckle from heat stress. Emergency lighting flickered, casting shadows that danced like they were auditioning for a horror production. The cubs clung with all 6 of their limbs, claws digging through the human's uniform in a way that would definitely require medical attention, assuming medical attention remained a possibility rather than an optimistic fantasy. Time to critical failure. 3 minutes, 9 seconds. 3 minutes. The escape pod bay waited approximately 400 meters ahead through 2 bulkheads that should have been open but weren't, because the universe had apparently decided that merely exploding wasn't dramatic enough. The human skidded to a halt at the first bulkhead, lungs burning with exertion and probably several exotic radiation particles that lungs weren't designed to process. The control panel blinked red, displaying error messages in 4 languages simultaneously, which seemed excessive but very on-brand for multi-species equipment. "Emergency override," the human gasped, slapping their authorization card against the reader with enough force to suggest the card had personally offended them. The panel beeped, considered, decided that protocols during catastrophic failure were more guidelines than actual rules. The bulkhead groaned open with the reluctance of metal that knew it was supposed to be sealed. The human didn't wait for it to finish. They squeezed through the gap, cubs and all, leaving behind a smear of blood on the doorframe from where the metal had introduced itself to their shoulder with excessive enthusiasm. In the escape pods, voices overlapped in what could only be described as controlled panic, which was still panic but with better grammar. There through the first bulkhead, the Rexian scientist reported, all 3 brains apparently dedicated to tracking one suicidal human's progress. Radiation exposure is now at levels that require immediate medical intervention. If they survive the next 2 minutes, someone added helpfully. The medical officer said nothing, but his vital signs, monitored by his pod's medical systems, suggested his cardiovascular system was having strong opinions about the situation. The human ran. Each step felt like their legs were considering early retirement. The cubs had stopped making sounds, either from shock or because they'd realized that the strange alien carrying them was operating on determination that transcended rational thought. The second bulkhead loomed ahead, this one fully sealed and displaying warnings that translated roughly to "Don't even think about it," in multiple languages. Behind them, a sound like reality tearing itself apart echoed through the corridor as the reactor's containment began fragmenting. Time to critical failure. 1 minute, 47 seconds. The human set the cubs down with surprising gentleness given the circumstances. Their hands shook as they accessed the emergency panel, fingers dancing across controls with the sort of practiced speed that came from years of fixing things that definitely shouldn't be fixed during emergencies. "Come on," they muttered. More prayer than command. "Just this once. Work the way you're supposed to." The panel flickered. The bulkhead mechanisms engaged with a grinding sound that suggested several components had given up on life but were powering through anyway, out of spite. The door began opening with all the speed of continental drift. The human didn't wait. They grabbed both cubs again, ignoring muscles that were filing formal complaints with their nervous system, and squeezed through the widening gap. The metal scraped against their back, adding new injuries to a collection that was becoming quite comprehensive. The escape pod bay opened before them like salvation wrapped in reinforced hull plating. One pod remained, its door open, emergency systems active and waiting. It had been programmed to remain until all personnel were accounted for, or until the station achieved what engineers called energetic disassembly. The human stumbled forward, legs finally deciding they'd had enough of this nonsense. They fell more than walked the last few meters, cubs tumbling with them in a mess of limbs, fur, and human determination that had exceeded its warranty. Time to critical failure, 53 seconds. They crawled into the pod, dragging the cubs with them. The door sealed automatically, recognizing that everyone still alive was now aboard. Launch systems engaged without waiting for confirmation, because the pod's artificial intelligence had excellent survival instincts, even if the occupants apparently didn't. Thrust, acceleration, G-forces that pressed everyone against the seats, with the insistence of physics asserting its authority. The cubs made sounds that might have been relief or might have been terror at this new form of danger. The human, strapped in by automatic restraints, watched through the viewport as the station fell away. Their vision blurred, either from acceleration or radiation exposure, possibly both. The cubs huddled against them, fur now displaying colors that suggested confusion had evolved into something resembling hope. Behind them, Kelthera Prime Research Station achieved critical failure with a sort of spectacular light show that would have been beautiful if it hadn't represented multiple violations of physics, safety protocols, and common sense. The explosion bloomed across space, a brief star that illuminated the escape pods floating at safe distance, each one containing crews who watched sensors confirm what they'd witnessed. 1 human, 2 cubs, all alive against mathematical probability. The medical officer's pod received the automated distress signal from the human's pod. Radiation poisoning. severe burns, multiple lacerations, exhaustion that suggested the body had been running on borrowed time and spite. But alive. Against all logic, against protocol, against every calculation that suggested this should have ended differently, they were alive. The rescue vessel's medical bay smelled like antiseptic and recirculated air, which was infinitely preferable to the alternative of not smelling anything at all due to being deceased. The human lay on a bed designed for species with different proportions, making the whole arrangement look vaguely comedic despite circumstances that absolutely weren't. Regeneration gel covered burns that mapped their journey through hell with geographical precision. Radiation treatments hummed quietly, convincing cells that maybe continuing to function was preferable to the alternative. The medical officer worked with the sort of focused intensity that came from treating someone who'd saved his children while simultaneously violating every safety regulation ever written. "You should be dead," he said, not looking up from the dermal regenerator he was calibrating. "The radiation exposure alone should have incapacitated you before you reached the second bulkhead." The human, slightly delirious from pain medication that human biochemistry processed differently than intended, managed something resembling a smile. "Yeah, well, forgot to check the schedule. Had other priorities." The cubs, treated for minor shock and bruising, huddled in the corner under thermal blankets. Their fur had settled into colors that suggested relief mixed with residual fear and possibly gratitude, though Velcor emotional chromatics remained somewhat mysterious to xenopsychologists. Outside, the rescue vessel carried 17 escape pods toward the nearest station, a journey that would take approximately 6 standard days. The crews had time to process what they'd witnessed, to review sensor data that confirmed events their brains still struggled to accept. Humans had been part of the galactic community for less than a century. They'd contributed technology, art, questionable culinary experiments, and a persistent tendency to ignore mathematical probability when emotions got involved. Most species found them confusing. Some found them dangerous. A few found them fascinating in the way one might find a star going supernova fascinating from a very safe distance. But every species now understood something fundamental. When humans decided someone needed help, protocols became suggestions and survival instincts became negotiable. The medical officer finished his work, stepped back, and looked at the human who'd risked everything for children that weren't even their species. His culture didn't have words for what he felt, but his actions spoke clearly enough. He placed one clawed hand gently on the human's shoulder, careful of the injuries, and simply nodded. The human nodded back, understanding transcending language barriers. In the corner, the cubs ventured closer, curiosity finally overcoming fear. They'd learned something today that would shape their understanding of the universe. Sometimes the scariest-looking aliens turned out to be the ones who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of galactic administration, someone was already drafting new protocols. Probably something about humans requiring special consideration during emergencies. Because apparently, when everyone else calculated survival, humans calculated something else entirely. Something that didn't fit neatly into equations but somehow added up to hope anyway. Years later, when xenoanthropologists studied humanity's integration into galactic society, they'd point to moments like these. Not the treaties or the technology exchanges, but the split-second decisions that defied logic. Other species calculated acceptable losses, risk-benefit ratios, survival probabilities. Humans calculated something fundamentally different, something that refused to abandon the vulnerable even when mathematics screamed otherwise. The cubs grew up telling stories about the strange alien who'd carried them through fire. And across 1,000 worlds, species began understanding that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their adaptability or their stubborn persistence. It was their absolutely magnificent inability to leave anyone behind.